Mr. President, if you might allow me, may I preface my speech with reference to the most glowing and most moving speech address we listened to from the President of the United States yesterday, the import of which was to get us to condemn the tragic death of the United States ambassador to Libya. And I'm sure we were all moved. We all agree that it was a tragic death indeed, and we condemn it. But Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, a year ago, we saw a barbaric and brutal death of the head of state of Libya, a representative of his country, a member of the African Union. That death occurred in the context in which NATO was operating supposedly in order to protect civilians. As we in spirit join the United States in condemning that death, shall the United States also join us in condemning that barbaric death of the head of state of Libya, Gaddafi? It was a loss, a great loss to Africa, a tragic loss to Africa, occurring in circumstances in which NATO had sought the authority of the United Nations Security Council under Chapter 7 to operate in Libya in protection of civilians who were said to be at the mercy of the government of Libya led by Colonel Gaddafi. The mission was strictly to protect civilians, but it turned out that there was a hunt, a brutal hunt of Gaddafi and his family. And Gaddafi and his family were sought NATO caught up with them. They suffered the brutal deaths that we know about, Gaddafi and some of his children. And as the United States spoke, I'm sure they were aware also that they were a NATO power, that they, alongside other NATO powers, had the authority under Chapter 7 to operate in protection in Libya in protection of civilians. But did it turn out to be that? In a very dishonest manner, we saw Chapter 7, the authority given under Chapter 7, being used now as a weapon to rout a whole family, to commit the murders that occurred in the country. Bombs were thrown about in a callous manner, and quite a good many civilians died. Was that the protection that they had sought under Chapter 7 of the Charter. So, the death of Gaddafi must be seen as in the same tragic manner as the death of Chris Stevens. We condemn both of them. Let me begin by reaffirming the rightful and important role of the United Nations in the management of issues affecting international peace and security. In the quest for a more just and equitable international order, Zimbabwe remains strongly opposed to unilateralism and is committed to multilateralism. We therefore would like to see a United Nations that continues to be a guarantor of world peace and security and a bulwark in the fight for justice and equality among nations. It behoves us all, therefore, to take the necessary steps to ensure that the United Nations is not marginalized on international issues. Equally important, the United Nations must in future never allow itself to be abused as it was in the case I've referred to, where NATO sought under Chapter 7 authority to protect civilians, and nay, it did not turn to be that. Nations must in future never allow itself to be abused. The United Nations Security Council must never in future allow itself to be abused by any member state or group of states that seeks to achieve parochial partisan goals. The Charter of the United Nations clearly stipulates that it is as an international body that should work for the good of all the peoples of the world, big and small. Mr. President, we recognize that there are existing and emerging threats and challenges that continue to frustrate our individual and collective efforts to attain greater economic development and social progress, as well as peace and security. But the increasing trend by the NATO states, inspired by the arrogant belief that they are the most powerful among us, which has demonstrated itself through their recent resort to unilateralism and military hegemony in Libya, is the very antithesis of the basic principles of the United Nations. In that case of Libya, the African Union and its peacemaking role was defied, ignored, and humiliated. The African Union was for dialogue between the Libyan Authority and the so-called revolutionaries. May we urge the international community to collectively nip this dangerous and unwelcome aggressive development before it festers. In this regard, Mr. President, the theme you have chosen for this session, namely, and I quote, bringing about adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations by peaceful means, unquote, is very appropriate. And this is what we in the African Union stress: settlement of disputes in a peaceful way, through dialogue. The warmongers of our world have done us enough harm. Wherever they have imposed themselves, chaos in place of peace has been the result. The situation created by the Bush-Blair illegal campaign in Iraq illegal campaign undertaken because it was alleged that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, when it was well known to these two and their governments that he did not have such weapons. And indeed, after invading Iraq, doing lots of havoc and getting rid of Saddam Hussein, they admitted that he had no weapons of mass destruction. And so why had they, in the first place, attacked Iraq? Why did they seek to get rid of Saddam Hussein? Was it merely because he was a dictator, as they alleged? No. He was head of a country which sat on tons and tons of oil. It was oil they required. And we saw companies rushing. Indeed, one company was headed by the brother of Bush, rushing to suck oil from Iraq. And this is what happened also in regard to Libya. The situation they created in Iraq has now brought about greater instability than there ever was. You have the Sunnis rising against Shiites, and vice versa, let alone the disastrous economic consequences of that unlawful invasion. The economy is unstable, society unstable, people fighting each other. Libya has been made equally unstable following NATO's deceitful intervention under the sham cover of Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations and the phony principle of the responsibility to protect. I listened to the speech made by the Secretary General. He made reference to this principle. It's a principle that can be abused and has been abused. And in any way, it is still being debated.